This video is about how to create criteria, especially when you're doing an evaluation. First, you need to have criteria. So why do you need criteria when you're doing an evaluation? Well, when you evaluate something, you make a judgment about that thing. But you first need to have some kind of structure that you use to make that judgment. So how are you making that judgment and why? So you first create criteria to provide structure for your evaluation. A couple of examples of criteria in your life that you may have run into. You might think about rubrics. So rubrics are a place where you can find criteria, okay? Students know how their writing or performances are being judged because there's a rubric, and the rubric has criteria on what looks good in this writing or performance and what is not doing so well, right? Job postings often have criteria listed so people know how they'll be evaluated as a job candidate, right? Okay, so this is kind of how criteria works in your life. So criteria, again, are the standards that you use to judge something or evaluate it. So let's say you want to get a meal at a restaurant that is cheap, fast, and has lots of vegetarian options. So cheap, fast, and lots of vegetarian options would be your 3 criteria. That's how you're going to evaluate any restaurant you go to using those 3 criteria. So the first thing you need to do is to define your criteria, okay? So before you start evaluating anything, you need to define and explain your criteria in your own words. So think about it. In your ideal world, what is cheap? Be specific, okay? Everyone has different definitions of cheap. Is cheap a $3 meal, a $10 meal, or a $100 meal? It really depends on who you are, right? And when I say cheap, do I mean low quality? Or, what do I mean exactly? Again, what is a fast meal? Consider negation. What is not fast? What about lots of vegetarian options? Could I offer an example? So cheap is explained here in my own words. A restaurant with cheap food options has several meal options that are under $8 per person. However, when I say cheap, I do not mean that the ingredients are low quality or lack in nutritional value. For example, vegetables like lettuce should be fresh and crispy, although not necessarily organic or locally grown. An example of a cheap food option outside of a restaurant is when I make a chickpea pot pie for my family. The meal is under $8 per person, but the ingredients like chickpeas, carrots, onions, and green beans are fresh, though not organic. Wait, I don't agree with your definition of cheap. That's okay. Maybe as you as my reader don't agree that cheap means under $8. That's totally fine. At least you know the criteria I'm using to evaluate whatever I'm evaluating, and that you might not agree with my criteria. You might not agree with my evaluation. That's fine. To support my definition of cheap, maybe I could do some research to provide evidence. What's the average cost of a restaurant meal, for example, or what's the average cost of a restaurant meal for a college student? Now let's say I am evaluating Chipotle as a restaurant. So do Chipotle's food offerings meet my criterion of cheap? Are there several food options under $8 per person? If so, what are they? Are the food ingredients fresh and not low quality? How do I know that? I would need to conduct some research to find evidence to make an evaluation. Maybe I could check Chipotle's website for the prices or observe the food in the restaurant. In sum, to start evaluating, after picking a topic, the first thing you need to do is define and explain your ideal criteria for something. Then evaluate something specific based on those criteria. Conduct research to provide evidence to support your evaluation, and then explain if your specific thing somewhat meets, or doesn't meet your criteria. That's where your judgment or your evaluation comes in.